Sienna Roberts, how are you? And here I am. How you doing? I hope you're okay. Thanks for coming in. I appreciate it. So let me turn this off and back I am. Hope you're all doing well. You know, I talk about music a lot. I put music shorts up every night for probably the last 5 or 6 months. I don't think I've missed a night. And I love music. Hey, Gerald, most of you know if you've ever come in here that I always end up using an analogy about music, or it's just really a great love of mine. I've written songs for over 40 years. I played in a band, and not to say that I was great, but I enjoyed it. It was something that oozed out of me, and it helped me through a lot of rough periods. Sienna, yeah, the 60s was incredible. And one of the things about the 60s that, and we'll get right into it here, that people that aren't from the 60s wouldn't understand. And I don't blame them for not understanding if you weren't from the 60s, or at the very least, too young to be entrenched in the 60s, but read enough about it and know the bands where you can kind of gather where they're from. The trends in the 60s were incredible. Psychedelic rock started. The rise of psychedelia, artists like Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, they pushed the boundaries of traditional rock music. Certainly. Songs like Purple Haze, Light My Fire, it incorporated experimental sounds and lyrical themes. You actually were going on a ride, so to speak, a magic carpet ride, which was a good song as well. Uh, and it reflected the counterculture movement of that era. Counterculture. Parents were wrong about everything. Even if they were right, you wouldn't admit it. Folk music revival. I'm in New York. You had Bob Dylan, John Sebastian, Peter Tork, and Nesmith from the Monkees were down in the Village. John Cage, you had the Beat Poets and all that. The folk music revival was very big. And there was a resurgence of interest in folk music. Dylan, Joan Baez led the way. Joan Baez was a great spokeswoman for women, that they could be taken seriously and that their words mattered. Songs like Blowin' in the Wind, California Dreamin', Mamas and the Papas, they became anthems of civil rights, anti-war movements, and it captured the spirit of the decade. Remember, the Beatles with Sgt. Pepper. The Summer of Love was only 67, maybe the end of 66, past 67, 68, you had the dropout hippies, Vietnam War hippies that had nothing to do with the colorful Summer of Love flowers and beads and all that. It was totally different. The Summer of Love people let their hair grow for a year, forgot to take baths, never changed their clothes, and it became Haight Asbury. But that movement where young people had something to say and were finally being listened to, I think that's what it was. After being stifled for so long, the youth of the 50s, where you'd sit at the dinner table, your hand clasped, mother, father, can I leave? And that wasn't happening anymore. Soul and rhythm and blue artists, right? Aretha Franklin, Marvin Gaye, they brought soul and rhythm and blue records to the forefront, to the music scene in the 60s. Songs like Respect, another woman anthem, right? I heard it through the grapevine. Powerful vocals, emotional depth, paving the way for future generations. The Al Greens, the Bill Withers of the world in the 70s, they came out of the 60s. Marvin Gaye and Otis Redding and maybe some Four Tops, Jimmy Ruffin. Garage rock started in the 60s. The rise of garage rock bands, makeshift studios or basements, recording studio basement. Boston, the group Boston in the 70s recorded out of the basement. A makeshift studio was all you needed if you knew how to incorporate your primitive mixing boards, 2 to 4 track click tracks and all that. The Kinks and the Animals embraced a raw, gritty sound like they were in their garage and you just had your little cassette player there. You Really Got Me, House of the Rising Sun, they became instant classics. Protest songs, social and political upheaval, we know that. Assassinations, terrible. Civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, just so many terrible, senseless deaths. And music played a key role in expressing the frustrations and aspirations of the era. Songs like For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield, Stand By Me, Benny E. King, right? It addresses the issues of war and racism, social justice, resonating with audiences around the world. The other countries really got a hold of it, especially England, where in England you had a lot of black artists because of segregation in America. They went to England. Jimi Hendrix, why was he in England? He was an American. Paul Simon went to England and hung out because it didn't deal with the racial tensions in England that America had, and the experimental sounds. Just go to A Day in the Life by the Beatles, All Along the Watchtower, Good Vibrations, uh, challenging listeners to expand their musical horizons, to start really looking at music differently than just background music that you heard on your parents' mono stereo. That's an oxymoron. Their mono phonograph. Now, it was a legacy also of influence. The music of the 60s continues to inspire artists of all genres and generations. Timeless appeal, enduring relevance. The only difference is technically the 60s you were challenged a bit. Technology in the 70s and 80s came to the forefront, where if you had bands like the Beatles recording now, it would sound totally different because it was primitive back then. But classic rock, soulful ballads, songs of the decade left an indelible mark on history, music history, and popular culture for decades to come. The top 20 songs in the 60s represent a golden era, uh, a diverse range of styles and influences, continues to resonate today. The iconic Beatles, Bob Dylan, the soulful voices of Franklin, Marvin Gaye. The 60s is a testament to the staying power of music and time and our fandom. You look at some of the songs, right? Hey Jude by the Beatles, an anthem as a pop song, right? I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles, an early anthem speaking to their fans. Remember the Beatles early on, From Me to You, Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, which was a cover. Always asking how the fans were until they grew up and then they wanted to tell you how they were. Respect by Aretha, My Girl by the Temptations, right? A Day in a Life, the Beatles, a storyboard incorporated two songs in one song, like a Rolling Stone, Good Vibration, Satisfaction, Blown in the Wind, Purple Haze, I Heard It Through the Grapevine, Light My Fire, California Dreamin', Born to Be Wild, Steppenwolf, Space Oddity. You actually felt like you were up there. House of the Rising Sun, For What It's Worth, You Really Got Me. The British invasion influenced Motown and vice versa. What an impact. A tremendous impact. And an impact that forever we will never quite understand, but believe we do. Mike, how are you? Yeah, the duality was interesting because it was all conservatism that once America had a reason to go mad when Kennedy was assassinated. And I think the Beatles became big because of that assassination. America was looking, the youth especially, was looking for something to grab on to. And they didn't even have to blame their fellow Americans. Oh, they came from England. It's not our fault. In the beginning, parents didn't like rock and roll because they thought it manifested itself from black music, shaking your body, and they thought it was devil music. And they were afraid. You're afraid of what you don't know. Just think of Bill Haley in the Comets, and 3 years later, I Wanna Hold Your Hand. Buddy Holly and the Crickets, how it changed in 3 or 4 years. In a 3 or 4-year period, from 60 to 65, music changed 2 decades. The counterculture, the progressive thought process. Uh, you were born in 2006. Wow, that's something. You're a youngster. But Gerald, how are you? Yeah, never get tired, G, of hearing Motown. But the just the way that we interpret music has changed as well, and why we interpret it the way we do. Now, by the 70s couldn't even decide what it wanted to be. Think about it. Um, you went from heroes of the 60s that were getting a little older, maybe breaking up, McCartney and Lennon, going their own way. You went from duos, the dynamic duos, Simon and Garfunkel, reaching from the 60s into the 70s, England Dan and John Ford Coley, Seals and Crofts. You had elevated music, soft rock, Bread, David Gates, and all that. Then the 70s didn't know what to do with itself, so disco came into the forefront. And then by 1978, you had kind of punk rock. You had the Joe Jacksons, Elvis Costello's, mixed jazz with rock and rockabilly, and you know, skiffle, which the Beatles came out of. And in fact, I've Just Seen a Face by Paul McCartney is an homage to skiffle, really, from where the Beatles came from. But you look at the songs in the 70s. Now, the interesting thing is I'm doing a class on B.J. Thomas Thursday of the great composers of the 20th century and following his music, because he wrote for Dionne Warwick and all that. Burt Bacharach, Raindrops, B.J. Thomas, Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head, right? 1970, tremendous hit. For a month, it was at number one. You had I Want You Back, the Jacksons coming out of Motown. Okay. You had Kids ruling the airwaves, right? You had Sly and the Family Stone, tremendous, with the funk and the synthesized keyboard. You still had Let It Be with the Beatles, Simon and Garfunkel with Bridge Over Troubled Water. You had the Guess Who, a Canadian band, American Woman, No Sugar Tonight. Ray Stevens, Everything's Beautiful. Remember that? You had the Carpenters, Phenomenon, unbelievable Karen Carpenter, Diana Ross coming out of the Supremes. Smokey Robinson was still around with Tears of a Clown in 1970, started off the decade. You would think that's a 1960 song. No, it's 1970. Joy to the World, Three Dog Night, a very elaborate cover band, pretty much. They didn't write their own stuff. They did Randy Newman stuff, and they did other things. Carole King evolved as a brilliant artist. Really, Carly Simon and Carole King took the torch from Dusty Springfield and Leslie Gore and changed it up a bit and owned it. James Taylor, Rod Stewart, Isaac Hayes. You had a little of everything. Al Green, Nilsson, the Shy Lights, Bill Withers, Gilbert O'Sullivan, Looking Glass, great song, Brandy, right? Mac Davis, Baby Don't Get Hooked on Me. Country was finding its way into the pop charts. Chuck Berry was still around with My Ding-a-Ling in 1972. Billy Paul, Me and Mrs. Jones. Sing About an Affair, and everybody could say, yeah, that's great. Right? Stevie Wonder, Roberta Flack, the OJs, Tony Orlando and Dawn even made it. Jim Croce, another country singer finding popular success. Gladys Knight and the Pips, Eddie Kendricks, Al Wilson. 1974 was Show and Tell, great song. Ringo, you had each Beatle now on their own doing their thing. You had Cher, you had television series, Tony Orlando, Sonny and Cher, bleeding into the pop realm. The Streak, a funny song by Ray Stevens, right? The song was just about streaking because that was something in the 73, 74 year. Paul Anka, Having My Baby. People found their way. Carl Douglas, you could do whatever you wanted. And even if you didn't do it well, it made its way to the charts. Now, the 70s was Booker T. Hey, Roy, how are you? Booker T, absolutely. Elmore James, Booker T and the MGs are great. Motown era has always influenced our music. And then you had the post Motown era, which was the Philadelphia, the Spinners, groups from Philly that weren't quite as Motown as Motown. They gave it an Eastern flavor, a little more danceable, a little less dependent on the uh, the gimmicks of Quincy Jones and Berry Gordy, more pop sounding. My Maria, great song. That's a great song, also, My Maria. Um, Cat Stevens. He just had great, great hits. And then a funny thing happened. A funny thing that we all were witness to here in this chat. The 80s. Now, the 80s, I always said, was a different era because you could put all the ingredients in a pot, stir it up, and out came Boy George and Grace Jones and blah, 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 blah. Now you have producers that it's a set recipe, and out comes Grande and Timberlake and Beyonce. You really can't be who you want to be anymore. Now it's a very controlled setting. Back in the 80s, you could have your own identity and they weren't afraid of it. Now they're afraid of it, especially with the culture in America the way it is now. But back then, you didn't care. Now, in the 80s, you had a second British invasion in the early 80s, started in the late 70s with the Police and Elvis Costello and Joe Jackson and Dire Straits, and then Clapton. And then you saw a full fledged Duran Duran, Robert Palmer, all of them, Culture Club, all these bands. You had solo stars that were with bands now, solo, Don Henley and Glenn Fry and Phil Collins, uh, Rod Stewart, who were in bands in the late 60s, early 70s, and now they're in their 30s. And they're trying to find their way a bit in the 80s. Paul McCartney in the mid 80s came out with an album, Press to Play, very tech. And that's why the 80s stuff didn't age well, because everything is overly produced in the 80s. Go listen to any 80s power chord song, and it's just too much in your face. You lose the lyrics because most of the lyrics weren't any good in the 80s. But, it had to be danceable. And you had songs like Red, Red Wine by UB40 that became an anthem. You had Addicted to Love by Robert Palmer, another. Stevie Wonder was really coming into his own. He had really gotten big in the early 70s, retired for a couple of years and came out with Songs in the Key of Life, which is one of the greatest albums of all time in 1976, with hit after hit on there. Sir Duke and Isn't She Lovely on there? I think it was. And I Wish, great album. Soft Cell, Tainted Love. You had everyone doing what they wanted. Even Bill Medley, right, from the Righteous Brothers, teamed up with Jennifer Warnes, Time of My Life. Bonnie Tyler, Total Eclipse of the Heart. You had strong female singers that wore suits and shoulder pads, and they were to be reckoned with. You have the Jacksons still. They took, the Jackson 5 away, and they came out with a couple of songs. Peter Gabriel's Sledgehammer. Fleetwood Mac was still prevalent. Michael Jackson was the biggest thing in the 80s, though. The Thriller. Paul Simon, You Can Call Me Al. They started writing for movies, Spies Like Us, Paul McCartney, Live and Let Die in the 70s, McCartney. You had Huey Lewis, which was a hit maker in the 80s, hit after hit, from The Power of Love to Back in Time for the movie. The Eurythmics were tremendous. Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers, Island in the Stream. 1983 goes from country and hits number one on the Billboard Top 100. So you had cross genre now. Everything had changed in the 80s. John Farnham, you're the voice. Just so much. I love the Human League. I love the Pet Shop Boys. Very, it was electronic, but it was good. The winner takes it all. You had ABBA still prevalent. George Michael came out of Wham and became one of the biggest stars in the mid 80s. Arguably the greatest decade for being who you wanted to be and doing it right. Here's Johnny, Genesis and Phil Collins. Yeah, Genesis changed when Phil Collins took over the lead. They were more of a prog band when Peter Gabriel was at the helm. Phil Collins directed them into mainstream because he knew that prog, look, yes, great prog band. Other than Pink Floyd, there really aren't any prog bands that sold 100 million albums. Think about it. All in the 50 million range. Floyd changed the way everything was looked at. But prog wasn't ruling the airways. And Collins knew that. Collins had a sensibility for being a star. And he led them in a direction with number one hits. Genesis is great. I love Genesis. Mike and the Mechanics, great band. You had Paul Carrack. He was from Ace in the 70s. He was a lead singer on Tempted by Squeeze. Yeah, MTV was instrumental, and VH1. VH1 ruined Billy Squires' career because of the stroke, because they tested VH1 in the Midwest. And that stroke video did not go well in the Midwest. And it almost ruined his career because of it. But yeah, and I always thought that MTV was like your master's degree, where you could have it on in the house anytime. And if you wanted to just get a quick look at what the artist looked like, you just go to the television for a second. I never knew. My first song that I ever learned the drums on was Build Me Up Buttercup by the Foundations. I think in 1983, I found out the lead singer was African American. Because, oh, that's my song. I went to look. Oh, really? You know, the Good Rats. You had so much, and no one had to apologize. That was the thing about the 80s. Anybody that wanted to have proof if there was life from outer space, go look at Grace Jones. You know, Grace Jones, very influential in her own way. She had a really good song, Dance to the Rhythm, I think it was. It was Slave to the Rhythm. It was a good song. Foghat. Yeah, Foghat was terrific. Fool for the City. You had a lot. The Foghat, the problem with Foghat is too many members went in and out. Blondie was great. Fine Young Cannibals were terrific. She Drives Me Crazy. You had so much good music in the 80s. And you could find something you loved in any club. Now, the problem with the 80s, it became so saturated with living to the excess that the message sometimes got lost. When you have a license, REO Speedwagon, when you have a license to pretty much do whatever you want and it's accepted, something gets lost in the message. The specialness, so to speak, leaves because you start thinking people are doing things just for the sake of doing them. I'm going to wear a black and white tuxedo with pink sneakers because I can. I really don't want to, but I can, so I'll do it. It became very commercial. That's why a band like Squeeze never made it. They didn't market themselves correctly. On MTV, you had to be very sexual, very sensual. That's why Duran Duran made it. You had to have that look, unless you were phenomenally talented. Look, Dire Straits, Money for Nothing. It was on every 3 minutes on MTV. Max's Kansas City, CBGB's. I played at CBGB's at 315. The owner had his dogs running all around. There was shit all over the floors of CBGB's. I remember Zappa used to hang out there a lot. The hair bands, yeah, the power chord bands made the 80s. Absolutely. And you weren't so worried about lyrical content. Think about songs in the 80s and take 5 songs that have amazing lyrical content. Yeah, you have a tough time finding them. They were more concerned with power chords and frontmen. In the 80s, bands, the frontman would do a 9-minute guitar solo. You'd have your electronic drums pounding away. People became very individualized in the 80s because they saw where it could get you. They saw a guy like Peter Gabriel become a superstar, Phil Collins, Don Henley, Lionel Richie. You had a lot of guys in the 80s that left bands in the 70s and became amazing. Oh, definitely. I'm glad you got my okay, John. Thank you. Uh, Steve Winwood, John Barleycorn Must Die. Great album. He was like 17 when he started, right? 16. I saw him about 12 years ago with Eric Clapton at the Garden. They were okay. Jefferson Airplane reinvented themselves as Starship in the mid 80s and came out with the cheesiest song. We Built the City on Rock and Roll. It was rated one of the cheesiest songs ever. Iron Maiden were good. Not my cup of tea, but they were good. Hey, Craig. Yeah, I've been going crazy with this. I've had so much to say, and I was snowed in. Now I teach tomorrow and Thursday. I got my car out. Thank God. Yeah, I forget what year it was. It might have been 13 or 14, maybe. They were at the Garden. They were good. Honestly, I was a little disappointed. I'm not a big Winwood guy. I think he's great. I think one of the most, if you could be really famous and be underrated, it would be Stevie Wonder. Stevie Wonder is one of the most talented individuals I've ever heard. He owned the 70s, Stevie Wonder. That album, people don't realize Songs in the Key of Life, how important that album is. I think it came out in 76. That album had a little of everything on it. Social commentary, danceable hits, what it was like to be him. Absolutely. Absolutely. It doesn't have to be on you, but I'd love to. Maybe Saturday would be a good day. I'd love to, Craig. It would be amazing. You saw Steve last year, and he's incredible. Still a 77. Oh, he was better. We were better as kids too. Well, you still are a kid, Sienna, but yeah, I was better. I love Sting. I love Sting. I had tickets uh, to go see Cream's comeback concert. I think it was 2007 in England, and I couldn't go. I think it was 2007. Their comeback, 6 or 7. I couldn't go. Um, Devo, Whip It. Yeah, they just came out with something. Uh, in fact, I think I played it, didn't I? Well, here goes my 8 cents advertising. See if I can find it. I just played it. That Brooklyn. No, I'm freezing. Uh, but yeah, I went to that theater. I saw Ringo there about 8 years ago. It's a great theater in Brooklyn. Oh yeah, Cream was amazing. Cream was amazing. Ginger Baker was unreal. Hey Maria. Oh, that's okay. Oh, Stevie Wonder. Depeche Mode. That is one of the most perfectly crafted pop songs. Enjoy the Silence, I believe. 1990. Crafted perfectly. Ginger Baker was a great drummer. Ginger Baker was a more technical Keith Moon. Um, Perfect track, Johnny. I agree. Perfectly recorded. Excellent. I saw them around 2014 in Atlantic City live. The Beacon's great. I'm going to see Joe Jackson at the Beacon in July. Jackson's coming. Jackson has a new song out. I think it's about him coming out of the closet. Good song. His album's coming out, I think, in March. I still call them albums. CD. Yeah, Craig, Depeche Mode's amazing. David Gann, they're terrific. They were great. I saw them live. I saw them at the Revel in Atlantic City. I got free tickets from my casino host. Probably 2014. Oh, really? Oh, you worked them. Oh, that's amazing. I The funny thing is, I took my son and I went on a Friday night and I said, "Wow, it's empty." I had the wrong night. It was Saturday night. I had to drive back down there because I didn't have a room. I'm around the box office. I said, "I can't believe no one's here." Because there wasn't a show. I had to come back. I think it was the end of August I went. End of August. I have the picture, actually. It was a long time ago. I could actually give you the exact date of when the concert was because I took the picture. It was around 13 or 14. But they were good. They really were good. Let's see. I'm just curious when it was. Probably 2014. Good concert, though. I didn't have the greatest seats, but it was a good concert. The Whispers, the Spinners are great. Rush has this new female drummer named Anka Miles. Oh yeah, Roy. I would think if yeah, they're not going to. There were so many. I love Duran Duran. Saw them the year before this last Halloween night at Madison Square Garden. They were amazing. They were all dressed up in costumes. They were real good. The album does, Danae. John Taylor is a great bass player. Earth, Wind, and Fire, yeah, very big in the 70s. Cool in the Gang, 70s into the 80s. Joanna, all that stuff. Earth, Wind, and Fire, Chicago was very big. Yeah, Duran Duran's amazing. Yeah, that Halloween album a couple of years ago was really good. They redid New Moon on Monday. They covered Painted Black by the Stones. Ohio Players, Pick Up the Pieces. Was that Pick Up the Pieces or was it the Average White Band? JT Cool. Yeah, the Average White Band, the guitarist was one of Paul McCartney. What was it, Hamish Stewart? The guitarist there was one of McCartney's touring band for a long time. Chicago was real good. Yeah, I saw them with Earth, Wind, and Fire about 15 years ago. They toured together. Really good. Philip Bailey was great. I remember Maurice White got sick and Philip Bailey became the lead singer again. I remember when he did Easy Lover in '85 with Phil Collins. Remember they did that song? Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Love this song. Spinning Wheel. Good song. They were stoned out of their heads at the end. They're trying to play horns and stuff. Roller Coaster was that 1975 or 76? The Macabre album is great. What a great album the Macabre album is. It's really a good album. He sounds good. Well, you also have pitch correct and stuff in the studio, but he sounds great. Yeah, Duran Duran was one of my favorite bands. And, they rediscovered themselves twice. They were dead in the ocean and then came out with Ordinary World in '93, the Wedding album. They saved their career. They were down. They broke up in '85. Uh, Simon Le Bon, Arcadia, he went with two of them, and the other two went and did Power Station. Um, Toto is very good. Great studio musicians. Those musicians were on the Thriller album. David Paich, Lukather, Jeff Porcaro are on the Thriller. He's the backing band for Michael Jackson in the Thriller album. Then they came out with their album, and they won Album of the Year the next year with Africa. They had a real hot run there because of Michael Jackson. Ambrosia's very good. Hall & Oates are great. What do they have? 7 number ones in the 70s. Yeah, David Peck is great. Ambrosia was terrific. You're the only woman I've been dreaming of, or something like that? You're the only, is that Ambrosia? Toto, yeah, amazing. I'll give you a story. David Paich agreed to hire Bobby Kimbrell as the lead singer. 15 minutes later, they weren't hanging out together. Steve Lukather offered it to Michael McDonald. Michael McDonald was 15 minutes away from being the lead singer of Toto. But they didn't want to go back on their offer to Bobby Kimbrell. And Kimbrell was like 8 years older than them. But Michael McDonald, because they were all California studio musicians. David Paich's father, well, Johnny Williams, who became a lead singer for them, Johnny Williams' father did the Star Wars. He used to do the music scores for all the big movies, Johnny Williams. And Johnny Williams now does that himself now. Yeah, they all came from Santa Monica. Gordon Lightfoot, he was great. Gordon Lightfoot, really interesting. Told stories. Eddie Rabbit, I love the rainy nights. Yeah, it was good. Yeah, there were so many. And that's when you know you're getting old, when you kind of remember them, but you don't. Just an incredible history as you get older. And now at 64, I believe I was old enough to remember the 70s well, old enough in the 70s to hear about the 60s and retain it, lived through the 80s. And I couldn't tell you 5 artists now that are on the radio. Love Roller Coaster, yeah. It's Sky High. What was that, 1976 maybe, 75 or 76, by Jigsaw. They had to change their name because there was a Jigsaw in the UK. They had to change their name to whatever it is, UK Jigsaw or whatever. They got sued. ABBA was tremendous. Music, I couldn't even listen to. I couldn't tell you who's who right now. I couldn't tell you, nor do I want to. I have Sirius Music. I have Apple. If I can't find it, I don't need it. I can find whatever I want to hear. And I still listen to the Beatles station on Sirius 18. But Elton John, Billy Joel. I went 97 to the Face to Face tour. I went to the Forum. It was the Forum in LA, now the Staples Center. Sarah, which one? Starship or Whole Notes? Sarah's a song I didn't like in the 80s until I had an experience about 10 years ago. Now I love it. Yeah, well, everything's changed. Everything has changed so badly. Sarah Smile, good song. 76, 77 maybe. I remember when Van Halen came out with Pretty Woman, and You Really Got Me in 77 or 78. Remember that? Sarah Smile, great song. 77, you had, Elton, not Elton, Eric Clapton. Lay Down Sally. You had Sultans of Swing. The late 70s was changing a bit. Yeah, Sarah Smile, good song. That's when you know you're good. When disco was destroying the airways and you're still relevant. Hall & Oates was so big that all you heard in '76 was Nights on Broadway by the Bee Gees. That was their actually, Nights on Broadway was their comeback song. Actually, Saturday Night Fever, they had that song written. They didn't write that especially for the movie or Staying Alive. That song was written already. Robert Stigwood bought an article from a magazine in England that spoke about Saturday Night Fever in England. The kids were going to the dance clubs, and he did the movie because of that. The OJ Backstabbers are great. I liked Al Green, the early 70s, Lean on Me and all that. Oh, that was Bill Withers. Uh, Al Green was great. Nights on Broadway was great. Yeah, that came out the same year or a year after My Little Town, which was Simon and Garfunkel's comeback. My Little Town was a good song. That was their comeback. Uh, Paul Simon's first song without Garfunkel was Me and Julio, down by the schoolyard, '72. Then he came out with Ryman Simon that had Loves Me Like a Rock and Kodachrome, and great album. Al Green was great. Yeah, Al Green was terrific. Bill Withers, a lowercase Al Green. Um, you had Cat Stevens, you had all those people. And then, really, Johnny, well, that's interesting. Houston, never been. Hall and Oates is a great band. I saw Hall and Oates a few years ago with Squeeze. Daryl Hall is a good friend of Glenn Tilbrook's, and Squeeze opened up for Hall and Oates about 5 years ago, 4 years ago. They were talking at the time. Oh, chicken cutlets, yeah. I'm a big chicken cutlet guy. So, '60s, '70s, and '80s. Tavares, great. Heaven Must Be Missing an Angel. Remember the song uh, When the Lights Went Off in New York City or something like that? Heaven Must Be Missing an Angel, yeah. Where were you when the lights went out in New York City? About the blackout. Yeah, '60s, '70s, or '80s, you pick. You can probably the '60s, more social message. The '70s, what it was like to be young in the '60s, and the '80s, who gives a shit about the '60s and '70s, other than a second British invasion. Here's Johnny DeBarge. Good song by DeBarge. Here's Johnny. Where's Johnny or here's Johnny? Where's Johnny, maybe. Good song. Benny Mardones. He was good. That's a great song. That Benny Mardones, that tells of a story. Yeah. There's just so much out there. Dan Fogelberg was tremendous in the '70s and early '80s. Dan Hill in the '70s, Sometimes When We Touch. Into the Night, great song. Um, just so much. As you can tell, music is a soundtrack to your life. Yes, she's just 6 years old, 16 years old. Yeah, it was a girl that father took off and had no money. Uh, yeah, because she was giving him money to clean her house and stuff, and his writing partner came in and he was looking her up and down, and he goes, "Oh, leave her alone." That's what happened there. So, everyone, I thank you again for always showing me the love and support. I truly do. It means a lot to me. It truly does. Craig, I'd love to see you Saturday. Sure, I'll be on here another 40 times before Saturday, but I have to teach tomorrow, so I got to go to sleep. Thank you, everybody, for coming in. I really appreciate it. You be well, be safe. Don't take any shit from anybody. See you soon.